about Budget 2023, the budget that the Minister of Finance had signaled would be a budget of restraint. So let's take a look at what restraint means for our Minister of Finance. Well, this is what it means. $63 billion in new spending. So that doesn't look much like restraint. To put it into a number that people can understand, that works out to about $4,300 per average Canadian family. And I don't think that that's what the average Canadian family identifies as being restraint. Now, the Minister of Finance will tell us that this spending is coming at a time when most of the pre-pandemic jobs have returned and most Canadians are working. I agree. Unemployment is down to 5%. I think most economists would call that full employment, and that's good news, of course. When people are working, they're paying taxes, and when they're paying taxes, the government is receiving revenue. So one might think that it is circumstances like this that would present the government with an opportunity to present a balanced budget, or maybe even a surplus budget, to pay off some of that extraordinary national debt that we accrued during the COVID pandemic years. But if that's what you're looking for, Madam Speaker, you'll be disappointed because that is wrong. What we have here is another deficit budget to the tune of $40 billion. So even in times of full employment and good government revenues, this government is still making no efforts to balance the budget. So much for restraint, nothing but empty words. Now, when we're talking about the economy, a logical question is whether we can trust the Prime Minister to deliver on his commitments. So let's take a look at his track record. Back in 2015, when he was the leader of one of the opposition parties and he was vying to become the Prime Minister, he promised the Canadian people that if he became the Prime Minister, that he would have some small to medium-sized deficits for 3 years, but in year 4 of his mandate, 2019, he would deliver a balanced budget. Well, we got the deficits, we got the debt, but we did not get the balance. What we did get was a new concept in economic theory presented by our Prime Minister, something like that. Don't worry about the deficit because budgets balance themselves. Now, he's never explained what that meant. It's still a mystery to us. Maybe it'll be in his soon-to-be-released memoirs. I'm looking forward to it. Now, this same Prime Minister also said that with an extra $20 billion a year in the civil service, his government would be able to deliver better services that Canadians need and rely on. Now, we got the spending, but we didn't get the services. What we did get was a very unhappy public service who is now on strike. 155,000 public service workers are on strike, fighting for better wages, wages that are keeping up with inflation that this government's inflationary spending has caused. The Prime Minister also said that he could build a Trans Mountain Pipeline for $7 billion. This was after he scared away private investment money that was quite happy to build a pipeline, but they abandoned ship, and the Prime Minister had no choice but to pick up the pieces. And the latest estimate cost to complete the project is now at $30 billion. So no, we cannot trust this Prime Minister on his commitments. Once again, this year, our Prime Minister gets an A for announcements and an F on delivery. Now, talking about the 2023 budget, we cannot separate that from talking about inflation. It's at a 40-year high. People are struggling to pay their bills. Food prices are up over 10%, and 1 in 5 Canadians is skipping meals. 1.5 million Canadians are regular food bank users, and the average rental rates stand at roughly $2,200 a month, and the average mortgage payments are now at $3,300 a month. These numbers are about twice what they were when the Prime Minister took office 8 years ago. These are not just numbers thrown around by economists. These numbers represent people's lives, represents the pain that people suffer. This is especially true for our young Canadians who are just getting started. 9 out of 10 people under the age of 25 believe that they will never own a house. This has always been the Canadian dream, but it's disappearing. Inflation is also particularly tough on seniors who are on fixed incomes. They cannot go on strike for inflation-adjusted wages. But now inflation also affects what governments can and cannot do. We have an accumulated debt of now over $1.2 trillion, and it is growing to the tune of $40 billion this year. And that debt needs to be serviced, just like the family mortgage has to be. And as the Bank of Canada hikes up interest rates to combat inflation, the government's mortgage payments go up as well, to about $43 billion this year. Now that's money that goes to wealthy bondholders, and that consequently is not available for government programs, like dental care, for example. And unless the government thinks that they don't have to worry about deficits, we're still waiting for the Prime Minister to explain that economic theory. Maybe he doesn't think that this is a danger, and maybe we're going to continue with deficit budgets into the future, and inflationary cycle continues. But there is hope, Madam Speaker. The Conservative government will turn all this hurt into hope. It'll ensure that Canada's economy works for those who do the work. The Conservative government will demonstrate with actions, not just with words, that future generations, young people, immigrants, can realistically hope for a secure future. We will bring common sense back into the budgeting process to ensure that taxpayers get value for their money. Now, Madam Speaker, I wanted to turn back to comments that our Minister of Finance made about a year ago in relation to the 2022 budget that she presented. At that time, she adopted a fiscal anchor: maintain a GDP ratio to a manageable level and keep it shrinking. And she notes that our debt to GDP ratio is not worse than other nations. Well, that's a pretty soft compliment to say we're not as bad as other people. But she also noted that Canada has a fundamental economic problem: lagging productivity metrics when compared to our major trading partners. It's a well-known fact that for every dollar that an American worker pumps into their economy, their Canadian counterpart contributes about 67 cents to our economy. Now, it doesn't mean that we're not working as hard as Americans. We're probably working harder than them. But our economy just isn't as productive. We don't have the tools. We don't have the scaled up companies and the efficiencies that go with that. And we have too many gatekeepers. Now, this is not what the Minister of Finance says. This is what our leader has been saying. We have too many gatekeepers that are getting in the way of productive Canadians and money that is looking for a good place to invest, and that are scaring investment away. But our Minister of Finance does acknowledge, at least, that we have a productivity problem. She calls it Canada's Achilles heel. Now, her predecessor, Bill Morneau, agrees. In his recently published book, he noted his frustration with his boss, the Prime Minister, of not being interested in economic and fiscal policies and the real challenges that face Canada's economy. This is what Mr. Morneau says of his former boss, the current Prime Minister. Quote, "So much time and energy was spent on finding ways to redistribute Canada's wealth, and there was little attention given to the importance of increasing our collective prosperity, let alone developing a disciplined way of thinking and acting on that problem." So, Madam Speaker, when thinking about the national debt, it's not sufficient just to talk about a debt to GDP ratio. We also need to look at our collective ability as a national economy to create the wealth that will service that debt, that will eventually pay down that debt, to secure Canada's future for future generations. Canada's abilities in that regard are severely challenged due to this Prime Minister's mismanagement of our economy. Madam Speaker, it's time for a Conservative government to take over the keys and to fix what this Prime Minister has broken.